Well, hello everybody. Happy Wednesday evening. Good to have you with us. And the scripture I have for you tonight simply says, those who endure to the end will be saved. Isn't it good to know that you're the group that endured to the end? So, but you got to endure to the very, very end. So you got to make it till we say goodnight tonight for that to be true. So we'll see how you do. All right. So tonight, we're going to do the last proof of God, the last proof of his existence that we have, and it's called the argument from morality. Now this one likes to get argued back and forth because certainly the non-believer will say that they can be moral too. And the answer to that is absolutely they can be moral too, but they can't give a reason for a basis for their morality. They just have a conditioning for their morality. So we're going to talk about that tonight in some detail. And this one's a bit longer, but we should have some time for a few questions at the end. So let's open in a word of prayer, and we'll finish it. We'll kick off our 8th week. Let's pray. Father, in Jesus' name we come to you, thankful for the 7 previous weeks, and pray for blessings upon this 8th week, Lord. And we pray that in all these things we've lifted you up, lifted up your Son, Jesus Christ, to show that you haven't left yourself a mystery, Lord. You've left evidence that we can follow, that you haven't asked us to believe blindly and without reason, but you've actually encouraged us to reason together with you. And as we reason together with you, we certainly find you there. So we are very grateful for that. And Lord, we ask for one more night that you would work in us and through us, to reveal yourself to us in deeper and more meaningful ways than we've ever had before. Premise 1 is that every law has a lawgiver, that we just don't get laws without a giver of those laws. Premise 2 is that there does exist a moral law that we all follow or violate. And that would lead to the natural conclusion that therefore there's a moral lawgiver. So if every law has a lawgiver, and there does exist a moral law, it would naturally follow that there is a moral lawgiver. So slide 150, as I move on through, I'm just giving this opening quote to the Declaration of Independence, and we'll touch on this a bit later as well. But as you know, the Declaration of Independence states that we hold these truths to be self-evident. So there's the claim for self-evident truths. There's truths out there that are true just upon observation of those truths. And what is the self-evident truth that led these colonists to actually break from the King of England? The self-evident truth, they said, is that all men are created equal. They think that's self-evident, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, rights that will never leave them, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They consider those three truths to be self-evident and not in need of proof. So that leads Professor J. Budziszewski said this: as he observes all people everywhere and their behaviors and how they set up their societies, he says all peoples everywhere exhibit basic principles of right and wrong, and that describes a moral law. So he says the moral law, therefore, is that which we cannot not know. He says the moral law, you cannot not know it. It's everywhere. It's evident in everybody. And what we're going to talk about are 8 ways that the moral law is self-evident. That I believe we can't deny that there's a moral law, and if every law has a lawgiver, and there exists a moral law, then it would conclude there must be a moral lawgiver. So the 8 reasons, you can find them on slide 152. Slide 152, the 8 reasons that we know that the moral law exists. Reason number 1 that we'll cover is that the moral law is undeniable. And I'll show you that when we get to point number 1. So first we'll say the moral law is undeniable. And then we'll say we know it by our reactions. So people will argue, hey, you say there's a moral law and people behave morally, but not everybody does. There's certainly immoral people out there. But we don't know the moral law exists because of our actions, because certainly people can indeed be immoral. We actually know the moral law exists because of our reactions. So I'll get into that when we cover number 2. The third way we know the moral law exists is that it always serves as the basis of human rights. You saw that in the Declaration of Independence. How do they establish the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? It's based on a moral law, which the Declaration states was our creator, that gives us unalienable moral rights. The fourth thing we'll cover is that the moral law is the unchanging standard of justice. So how can you have a court system that we're judged by, our behavior's judged by, unless there's an unchanging standard of justice somewhere? The fifth reason we know that it exists is that it defines a real difference between moral positions. So when people take different moral positions, what are they holding as a standard for their position? There must be a moral law they're using as their standard. The sixth thing we'll cover is that if we can know what's absolutely wrong, that means we must have some idea about what's absolutely right. Because the argument usually comes back that we can't know what's absolutely right. And that's sort of true, but what we can know more certainly is what's absolutely wrong. More people agree on things that are absolutely wrong than they do what are absolutely right. All right. For some reason, I can't see the bottom 2. They'll have to be a surprise for later because my slide won't slide up for some reason. So anyways, let's get into the first one, that the moral law is undeniable. So any attempt for somebody who harbors relativism, that they believe that truth is relative, truth is in the possession of the beholder, so to speak. Whenever they deny the moral law, they end up proving it. Now, how can that be? Their claim that there are no moral absolutes, they claim that there's no moral absolutes, but they will always say it's wrong if you mistreat them. So if somebody says, hey, there's no moral absolutes, and then you punch them in the mouth for that, they will claim that that was wrong. And that's always wrong to do that. What I do when I teach this to the students, usually I'll find somebody with their phone out, I'll look for that phone, and as I'm teaching that people always, even if they don't claim that there are moral absolutes, they'll say it's absolutely wrong to victimize them in any way. And as I'm saying that, I'll just take their phone and stick it in my pocket, and then I'll act like I didn't do anything, and I'll just keep teaching. And at some point, they go, you have my phone. And I'll say, no, it's actually my phone now. And they'll say, oh, I'll get it after class. No, I'm taking possession of it. I own it. I'm actually going to change the phone number on it. I'm going to put my contacts in, and I'm going to do all that. No, you're not. Why not? That's wrong. Says who? Suddenly you seem to be very sure that this is absolutely wrong. So people are never okay with someone stealing from them, even if that thief does not believe in moral absolutes. They will absolutely agree that it's wrong to victimize them, even if they don't believe in absolutes. So the person that denies all values, let's go to that extreme. The person that denies all values, nonetheless, values his right to deny these values, doesn't he? In other words, it's absolutely impossible to have a zero value system, because at the very least, you will value your opinion that there are no values, and that's a value you hold. So when they say everything is relative, they end up on a base level having something in common with everybody, that there is indeed at least some moral absolute. The last verse in the book of Judges, to me, is the key verse for this, because as it's telling you what a mess Israel is morally, it says that everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. Notice that every one of those words is positive. Everybody, in other words, they're all in agreement. There's unity on this thing. Everybody's doing what's right. That's a lot better than doing what's wrong. And it's in their own eyes. But so why does that phrase "in their own eyes" automatically trigger in us that their country is a disaster morally? Because we know if everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes, they're not following a moral absolute. They're using relative standards. And just by the hearing of that, We know they're in moral decay and moral depravity. All right, so we know it. We know that it's undeniable. It just can't be denied. The second way I propose that we can know this is by our reactions. And I want to tell you about an Indiana professor who failed a relativistic student who wrote a paper on moral relativism. And within that paper, the student wrote that moral values are preferences, like chocolate and vanilla. Some people like chocolate, some people like vanilla, and nobody's wrong for what they like. And the same is true for preferences on moral principles. So the professor put a big fat F on the paper and turned it back into the student. And the student protested, said, "This is a good sound paper. Why did I fail?" And he said, "Because you turned it in a blue folder." And the student said, "So what?" The professor says, "I don't like blue folders. So therefore you fail." And the student freaked out on him and protested that that was wrong. And the professor used quotes from his paper to say, "You convinced me that this is not wrong, that I have a right to say that this paper is not worthy of a passing grade because of my distaste for the blue folder." So quickly, the student changed his mind on his conclusions. What did we see on 9/11/2001? We saw universal moral outrage of Americans over the taking down of the Twin Towers, the bombing of the Pentagon, and the taking down of the plane in Pennsylvania. Universal moral outrage, all in agreement that it was wrong. Now, some people object and say, well, it's not a universal moral, an absolute moral principle, because the Muslims didn't agree. They thought it was upright for them to do that. They thought it was a moral act for them to do it. But if you did that same exact act to the Muslims, would they say that's fair because it's an absolutely right thing to do? Or if you say it's right, then it must be right? No, they would protest that it's absolutely and always wrong to do that to them. So, the moral law is not always the standard by which we treat others, but it is always the standard by which we expect others to treat us. That's why I say we can know there's a moral law based on our reactions more than we can on our actions. So yes, people will act immorally, but how does that prove the moral law? Because if there was no moral law, there'd be no ability to say that it was an immoral action. Because what are you comparing that action to? And people's reactions that they were wronged prove that they're sensing a moral law does indeed exist. All right. The third reason we stated is that the moral law is the basis for human rights. So again, the Declaration of Independence starts as we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're writing to the King of England. They're saying, listen, we don't have to fully explain this stuff. We know that you observe what we observe, that there's certain rights that human beings are endowed with by their Creator, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we feel so strongly that you violate our pursuit of life and liberty and happiness under your reign, that we're breaking from you because our Creator has endowed us with certain self-evident truths that are being violated under your rule. And they're so self-evident that we're willing to go to war over these self-evident truths. All right. Now, think about the Nazi war criminals that went on trial in Nuremberg after World War II. The only way the international community could convict these Nazi war criminals who were just obeying orders, they just obeyed orders to do the horrible things that they did. Could they be held morally responsible for their actions? Well, if there were no universal moral law that transcended the laws of secular Germany, then the Allies would have no grounds to condemn the Nazis. We couldn't have said the Nazis were absolutely wrong unless we knew what was absolutely right to do. So they were able to convict these Nazi war criminals of war crimes, crimes against humanity, based on a principle that went against Germany's laws. But they said it's so self-evident and universal, these moral laws that you violated, that they actually convicted these Nazis, war criminals. Okay, so those of you who are following along on the slides, I'm on 159. Our fourth point is that the moral law is the unchanging standard of justice. And I'm going to quote one of the most quotable men of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis. He was a former atheist, and when he was dealing with the problem of evil, he said this: as an atheist, and Mike, if you want to show this, I'm on 159. 159, so they could read along on the screen in case they don't have the slides with them. So on slide 159, C.S. Lewis says this. I'll give it another second here. All right, here we go. So C.S. Lewis, a former atheist, in dealing with the problem of evil, wrote, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And this reasoning led Lewis to Christianity. So I personally love the short, pithy saying that he has there, that a man does not call a crooked line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. So how would you know that the universe is evil or cruel if you don't know what a just and a friendly universe looks like? You would have nothing to compare it to. Now this goes for all sorts of things. How can you say that Johnny is more moral than Stephen unless you have some idea of what perfect morality is, that Johnny is approaching more closely than Stephen is? Okay, we can take the slide off. So C.S. Lewis, like you and me, can only detect injustice because there exists an unchanging standard of justice that's written on our hearts. You can't know what evil is unless you know what is good. And you can't know what is good unless there's an unchanging standard of good that's outside of yourself. And that's the key. Does there exist a standard of good that's outside of us? If it's inside of us, it becomes relative, becomes an opinion or a preference. But if it's outside of us, then it's to be discovered. It's to be discovered, and we have to discover what those moral absolutes are. Without an objective standard, any objection to evil is nothing but your own personal opinion. So if there were no moral law, then we wouldn't be able to detect evil or injustice of any kind. Likewise, unless there's an unchanging standard of good, there's no such thing as an objective evil. But since we all know that evil exists, then the moral law must also exist. The fifth point of the argument for God's existence from morality is that the moral law establishes differences in moral positions. So how do we all seem to agree that Mother Teresa is more moral than Adolf Hitler was? There would have to exist a perfect standard of morality in which to compare them. C.S. Lewis again explains this. And I hope I can see the bottom of this slide. Let's see. C.S. Lewis says this: the moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other one does. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either one of those things. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing. Now, what are you comparing those things to? Okay, so the only way to objectively know that morality of Mother Teresa is better than that of Adolf Hitler is if there's an absolute morality in which to compare them. So statements like murder is evil, or racism is wrong, or you shouldn't abuse children have no objective meaning and are just a matter of personal preference without a moral law being written on everybody's hearts. We all know the above statements are absurd, so moral relativism is false, an objective moral law must exist. The sixth point is that the moral law allows us to know right from wrong. So relativists will argue the point that we can know what is wrong, like racism and murder, but that nobody can truly know what's right. They take this side of the issue knowing that if right can be known, then that points to an absolute standard. But you expose their faulty reasoning when you ask them, how do you know what's wrong unless you know what's right? You can't know that 5 is the wrong answer to 2 plus 2 unless you have some idea of what the right answer is. So relativists claim that nobody has the truth, that it's all up to your own personal preferences. That very claim is a truth claim, isn't it? That they know and nobody else knows. So they say, hey, nobody has the truth, but you understand that that's a truth that they're expressing, saying I'm right and you're wrong about this. They're saying it's absolutely true that there's no absolute truth. Isn't that a contradiction? Okay, so they can't even get their point out without contradicting themselves. They're saying, hey, there is no absolute truth. And you're to say, are you absolutely sure that's true? Is that an absolute truth you're giving me? And they're stuck right there. So their argument is self-defeating. The seventh point, which I couldn't see on my slide before, so this might be new information for you, but the seventh point is the moral law is the grounds for political and social dissent. Now, I know we don't have any political and social dissent to compare this to. I know we never see that in our society, so you can use your imaginations a little bit with me tonight. Imagine that people actually went out and protested something, and they're protesting saying, hey, this is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. Well, what do they have the basis to say it's wrong for? They're saying it's absolutely wrong, and I'm protesting it, not because they can't protest something saying, hey, I think this is wrong, and I know you might think differently because you have your truth and I have my truth. That will not lead to social dissent. That will not lead to protest. Protest comes when they think everybody's doing a wrong and I need to say something and everybody ought to agree with what I'm saying. So when there's protests against war, protests against anti-abortion laws or anti-sodomy laws, they can no longer hold their relativist stance. And believe it or not, what you find most of the time, the people that protest out there are relativists. But as soon as they protest, they must forfeit their relative positions because they're telling you, you ought to agree with me. I'm protesting because I'm saying you're wrong and you ought to agree with my point. So therefore, they believe in an absolute standard. In an atheistic worldview, there's no basis for right and wrong, so there's no basis for them declaring that they're right and the church is wrong. And the eighth and final point is this. If there were no moral law, then we would never make excuses for violating it. If we violate a moral law, we find ourselves either confessing or making excuses. A confession or an excuse is an admission that you violated a universal principle. Even the relativist mantra of tolerance is an admission of the existence of the moral law. Why? Why do they use the word tolerance? When they ask you to tolerate something, it's an admission they're asking you to tolerate something that's wrong. Nobody asks you to tolerate good behavior. Nobody asks you to tolerate things that are right. Nobody says, she is a very sweet person, please tolerate that in her. So toleration is an admission that something is wrong and that you should just endure that wrong. But for them to say that it's wrong implies a universal moral principle. Nobody was ever asked to tolerate Mother Teresa. So what do Darwinists say about the moral law? What happens when you actually get an evolutionist and you bring up the argument from morality? Nearly all of them avoid the topic altogether because it really doesn't lead them anywhere where they want to be. But there is a Darwinist named Edward O. Wilson who takes on this point. He believed that people pass morality on through their genes to their offspring. He says through thousands and thousands of generations, it will inevitably give rise to moral sentiments. So we know that the Darwinist claims survival of the fittest, and we'll get some quotes about that in a few minutes. But survival of the fittest and inheriting genes over thousands of years that produce morality are counterpoints. They go against one another. Survival of the fittest says, I simply survive because I'm stronger or I can reproduce better. It does not say I'm learning how to get along with my community so that we can mutually support one another. No, it's saying if I can kill and eat and survive, then I kill and eat and survive. And if you're the victim of that, then evolution simply doesn't allow you to continue on. That is not developing morality over the centuries. This means morality is genetically and materially formed, is what they are saying. Yet we never find a moral gene in us. We don't find a love gene in us. We don't find a goodness gene in us. So Edward O. Wilson believed that morality is based on inherited feelings or instincts, and that's not an objective standard of right and wrong. This is the same faulty understanding of natural selection they're now using in morality that we've seen this natural selection fail biologically. A few weeks ago, we went through the 5 lines of science that don't allow for biological evolution, and now they're using that same faulty reasoning here for morality. So, if you're following along, I am on now 170. And I'm going to present 6 proofs why moral natural selection is inadequate to explain morality. So the Darwinian principle of natural selection that they're proposing will allow for thousands of generations to work together better to adapt morality, that now over those generations more morality will arise. And it seems to me that if evolution's been going on for tens of thousands of years, we should have more peace in humanity by now. When the 20th century was the deadliest century in history. And the 21st is off to a roaring start, isn't it? So I don't know about this inherited morality. Now, 6 proofs. Proof number 1. Darwinists assert that only materials exist. There's no supernatural world, it's only the natural world. But materials don't have morality. So if they're going to be a naturalist and only believe in the material world, what exactly in this material or what exactly in this nature has morality? Where did morality come from? How much does hate weigh? Can you measure the hate that came through your materials, through your genetics? Where's the love atom? What's the chemical composition of the murder molecule? These questions aren't asked because it's not a naturalistic thing. As one can see, physical particles are not responsible for morality. A second proof. Wilson suggests that morality is merely an instinct, but this cannot be, and this is my favorite argument of them all. Morality cannot merely be an instinct because we have competing instincts. Something often tells us to ignore our stronger instinct to do a nobler act. So before I tell you how C.S. Lewis writes this, let me explain it first so that when I read what he writes, I think it'll come across clearer. He says, morality cannot be an instinct as Edward O. Wilson tries to explain. Why? Because if it's an instinct and it's developed over thousands of generations, then there should be no competing instinct against it. The competing instinct would have been eliminated by evolution. But we have competing instincts. And the example Lewis will give, I think, is a great one. He'll say, if you're standing by a raging river, on a raging river bank, and you see across that river a 12-year-old boy fall into the rapids, you're going to have 2 competing instincts at the very moment you see that. Instinct number 1, jump in and save the boy. Instinct number 2, stay on the bank and stay safe yourself. You will immediately have both those instincts, won't you? Okay? But now here's the proof of a moral law that's outside of ourselves, not within ourselves. Within ourselves, we experience the tension of jumping in and saving the boy and staying on the bank. But Lewis will point out that there's a third instinct that's not part of the 2 competing instincts. It's separate from that. that we call our ought to. There's something that we universally agree we ought to do. And if we do the one, we'll be considered a hero. If we don't do that one, we'll walk away in shame and probably won't tell anybody what we saw. Somehow we know we ought to jump in. We ought to try to save the boy. And if we walk away staying safe, we probably won't go home and say, like I wouldn't come home and say, honey, I just saw a 12-year-old boy fall in the river. And boy, I just left. I took off, made sure I was safe. You think she'd go, oh, you're my hero. That's wonderful. I can't wait to tell the neighbors the great thing you did today. No. There would be shame that would come with that. Why? I violated the ought to. We all have an ought to in us, and the question is, where did that ought to come from? It's not one of the competing instincts that Wilson says came through us evolutionary-wise. The competing instincts that he's talking about would not compete. They would cooperate if they developed over thousands of years, and we're eliminating the competing instincts as evolution would do. Then we would just have the one instinct, and based on survival of the fittest, it would be walk away. That's my competition drowning. That's another mouth to feed drowning. It's less competition for food. So it would almost be a good thing. And if you think that's an extreme thing for me to say, you ain't seen nothing yet. All right, so here's how C.S. Lewis says it. But you will find inside you, in addition to these two instincts, the one to jump in the water and the one to stay safe, he says, you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing which judges between two instincts that decides which should be encouraged cannot itself be either of them. You might as well say that the sheet of music which tells you at a given moment to play one note on the piano and not another is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. I love that example. I think he picks a wonderful example. He would say, if you think the ought to is just another one of the competing instincts, it says that's like believing that when you play a piano, to play a song or a symphony well on a piano, you have to hit a certain key at a certain time and follow that with a certain key at a certain time, and it has to follow exactly to produce that symphony. But if you think that the ought to is part of the instincts, that's like saying the sheet of music that's telling you which key to hit and when to hit it is part of the piano keys themselves. It's not. It's separate from the piano keys. It's different than the piano keys, but it tells you what you ought to do. And if you follow the piano music and do what you ought to do, you end up with the symphony. But if you violate the ought to, then you get something less than the symphony. And that's where the shameful act comes in. So explaining the universal ought to is where God becomes, I want you to hear this very closely because Thomas Aquinas used this phrase and I think it's so helpful. He says this ought to makes God a necessary being. It's not a faith-based being. It's not a wishful or hopeful being. He says when you study the things like morality or even science, because this is where Thomas Aquinas was addressing science and the creation of the universe, he said God is a necessary being. That it's things are only possible the way we see them if God exists. There's no possibilities for the universe coming out of nothing, or for life coming from non-life, or for intelligence coming from non-intelligence, or for this universal ought to that everybody would judge the man that walked away from that 12-year-old boy as being wrong. We would all say he was wrong for doing that. That wasn't very noble at all. How do we have agreement in our hearts about that? Because God's law is written on our hearts, and that makes the moral law universal. So the ought to is what directs us towards the morality of God. Now, the sixth proof is that Darwinists cannot explain why we should obey morality. Darwinists cannot explain why we should obey morality. Now listen, Darwinists can explain that we should obey morality. They do agree with that, unless they're really criminal-minded. But that's not what we're getting at. We're not saying that they're immoral, and we're not saying that they don't know that they should be moral. What we're saying is if we say, why should we be moral, they're bankrupt in an answer. If their theory of life and death and the material morality is correct, then why shouldn't we murder, steal, and rape? Why should the rich and powerful cooperate with the less powerful, sometimes even at their own expense? History is replete with such characters, and they're always remembered negatively. We never remember those who serve their own self-interest, the rich and powerful that use their power to increase their riches. We never remember them fondly. We always remember them in very negative ways, universally so. Now, nor does anybody take the philanthropist who takes maybe the thousands or the millions that he's earned and selflessly gives them to those with greater needs than him, and not universally say that that was a good thing to do. There's universal agreement on these principles. The ideas that accompany a Darwinist or an atheistic worldview have severe consequences. These ideas have severe consequences. Adolf Hitler's justification for the Holocaust came from Darwinism. In his book Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, he wrote this. He says, if nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with stronger individuals, nature wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior race. Because in such cases, all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher state of being may thus be rendered futile. So Adolf Hitler got his motivations for ethnic cleansing from Charles Darwin's theories of evolution. He says if you allow inferior races to exist, you're slowing down the evolutionary process. He believed that evolution would one day leave us with just a white race. All non-white races would evolutionary-wise be eliminated. All he tried to do was to speed up that evolutionary process so that he could experience the utopian world of white supremacy. That is a Darwinian evolutionary concept. In fact, that's where it originated from. It is evil. It is sinful. It is very anti-God. But this preservation of the races, which by the way was a subtitle of Charles Darwin's book, his of course most popular book, I got Mein Kampf in my head, so somebody help me in the house here. Charles Darwin's, somebody unmute yourselves and get my brain lock loose. Very famous book. Charles Darwin, help me out. I'm stuck. Anybody? All right, he wrote a book, and it changed the world. The Origin of Species. Thank you, I got it. The Origin of Species. Now, if somebody looked it up, please tell me the subtitle, because it took me that long to get the title. I'll never get the subtitle. It's something like The Struggle. Do you have it? Subtitle of Charles Darwin's book. It's very, very racist.
By means of natural selection.
Preservation of favored races.
The preservation of favored races by means of natural selection. Natural selection will single out the favored races and eliminate the others. They don't teach our high school kids, when they teach them Darwinian evolution, they don't give them the subtitle, do they? They just say The Origin of Species with no subtitle. Because how would our minorities feel that they're learning the science behind eliminating their race from the planet? Now, such a preservation of the races goes hand in hand with the inexorable law that it's the strongest and the best who must triumph and that they have the right to endure. That's survival of the fittest. He who lives must fight. This is Adolf Hitler. He who lives must fight. He who does not wish to fight in this world, where preeminent struggle is the law of life, has not the right to exist. Now think of your Savior. Did he come to fight? Did he come to battle? Christians are taught to practice peace whenever possible. Darwinism teaches that disqualifies them from their right to live. Because if you're not here to fight, you lost your right for evolution to support you in your survival. The famous Scopes trial from 1925 exposed the racist overtones of Darwinism. The high school biology textbook under consideration spoke of 5 races of man and concluded that Caucasians are the highest type of all. The Bible says otherwise. You can refer to Genesis 1:27, Acts 17:26 to 29, Galatians 3:28, and it also contradicts the Declaration of Independence. Now that was very anticlimactic that I quote the Bible and then I say, oh yeah, and the Declaration of Independence. I should flip those around. The climax, of course, is the Bible. But it also contradicts the Declaration of Independence, which led us to say, because we're all created equal, therefore we want to break from you, King of England, because we want to pursue life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in a way that you're not allowing us to do. And because of our self-evident truths, we're breaking from you. All right. If nothing's made you uncomfortable, I'm going to try harder. Here we go. The moral implications of Darwinist ideas. Princeton professor and Darwinist Peter Singer used Darwinism to make this claim, that the life of a newborn child is of less value than the life of a pig or a dog or a chimpanzee. As a consequence, Peter Singer believes that parents should be able to kill their newborn infants up until they're 28 days old, out of the womb 28 days. But why does he randomly pick 28 days? What changes on the 29th day that they have the right to live, or the 30th day? Now, I can go backwards with that as well. If you would not kill a 1-day-old child, what's the difference a day earlier when it was its last couple hours in the womb? And if you are against partial birth abortion, but you're in favor of abortion, my question to you is, if you wouldn't kill a child the day before it's born, then what about the day before that? What changes? Or the day before that? What changes? Or the day before that? And I'll go all the way back to conception and ask you what changes. Where did humanity begin? At what day do you go, it wasn't human that day, but the next day it achieved humanity in the womb? And if you can't identify that day, then you have no idea if you're murdering or not in the womb. You have no idea. And if you're doing an act that you don't know is murder, the only right thing to do is not do the act. There's no time for abortion. And I believe it violates a universal principle. God has said the woman's womb is dedicated as the one place in our universe for conception to happen and for a child who's utterly helpless to be cared for and nourished and grow until it's ready to come out of the womb. America says it's the only place you have no right to life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. You have no protection from murder until you can make your way out of that womb. If children could talk after 1 week of conception, you would hear their cries and screams for mercy. Now, I'm sorry I made that political, but I can't help it, and I mean it. All right, moving on. Ideas have consequences. Those who truly embrace Darwinism have no moral reason for not saying, I'll give you 4 weeks to kill your kid out of the womb, and I think that's fair and reasonable. His worldview would allow murder at any age, because he does not believe that there's a moral lawgiver. Now, the book called Created from Animals by James Rachels, and because we're in the Calvary community, please know I did not say Jason Rachels. This is not the headmaster of CCA. This is a different person altogether. His name is James Rachels. He's the author of Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. That's his subtitle. So he's saying, I'm writing on the moral implications of Darwinism. Here's what I believe. He believes that humans have no more inherent value than animals. And here's what he says of the mentally handicapped. Of mentally handicapped human beings, he says, what are we to say about them? The natural conclusion, according to the doctrine of Darwinism, will be that their status is that of mere animals. And perhaps we should go on to conclude that they may be used as non-human animals are used, perhaps as laboratory subjects or as food. The mentally handicapped. Ideas have consequences. If you give people the idea that there's no absolute, then this is where that human heart will go. can go anyways. Authors Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer claim the following about rape. They say rape it's as natural a biological phenomenon that's a product of the human evolutionary heritage, just like the leopard's spots and the giraffe's elongated neck. They believe rape is natural. Why? Because it's survival of the fittest. And what is your fitness? How is that determined? It's not necessarily strength, because everybody's going to die no matter how strong you are. So it's more based on your ability to reproduce yourself. Those that can reproduce themselves the most are the fittest, because that's the only way to survive this life is through your offspring. That's what makes you the most fit. Now, they would say that if a man wants to impregnate a woman and she says no, and he's physically stronger, then evolution should allow him to overpower her and impregnate her, because that's part of his fitness. It's part of his ability to survive. So therefore, rape goes from rather being a major crime to now a virtue in evolution. And I know you're thinking I'm exaggerating, and I'm going to tell you that I'm not. This is where these ideas lead. The Darwinist conclusion about murder and rape are consistent with a worldview where all behaviors are genetically determined. Remember, they think we're molecules to man. We start off as molecules and now we're mankind. So the question becomes, if we're nothing but molecules in motion, then who on this planet can tell me that my molecules are wrong and yours are right? If I want to murder and you say that's wrong, you're judging my molecules and you're judging that your molecules are better. And who says that that's so? Who gets to make the rules? If you get pulled over by a cop, you can literally say, who are you to stop my car? I'm a cop. Look at my badge. Who cares about the badge? Who gave you the badge? Who says a badge means anything? Who got to make these rules? Well, our government did. Well, I wasn't at that meeting, and the government officials came out of the womb bloody and naked just like I did. So what makes them the rule makers and not me? I now determine that I'm the rule maker. Why is that not logical if there is no moral lawgiver? Just because I wasn't born or invited to the meetings where we made up the rules doesn't mean I have to follow them, because who are you to tell me how my society is going to go and how my life's going to go? You have no inherent right to tell me how to live if there's no moral lawgiver. Let me get back to the notes because I'm getting worked up a little bit. All right. Concluding thoughts on morality. There is an absolute standard of right and wrong written on everybody's heart. Their actions may contradict it, but their reactions will reveal it. Relativism is false, and it's dangerous. Humans do not determine right and wrong. We discover right and wrong. That's like saying we determine mathematics. We don't determine mathematics. We discover mathematics. They already exist outside of us. We have to find out what those truths are, which exist outside of us. It's the same with morality. It exists outside of us. We have to discover what morality is. We don't make it up ourselves. Third concluding thought. The moral law must come from outside of ourselves, since it is a prescription written on our hearts, and prescriptions need prescribers. We don't just get prescriptions without somebody prescribing them. The moral law is God's standard of rightness and allows us to adjudicate between different moral positions. All right. Now, I concluded on slide 183, and honestly, half of it's cut off, and I don't know if there was more on the bottom. I don't know why I can't move it up and down. So maybe you have some more information there, maybe we don't, I don't remember. But anyways, I think the point's been made. That if we go back to 149, where we started, my claim was that every law has a lawgiver, and that there is moral law. So if there is moral law and laws have lawgivers, then there must be a moral lawgiver. And I think we established some pretty persuasive points that what we observe in our world is universal consent, that nobody likes to be a victim of a crime. So our reactions to that crime are universally in agreement that something went wrong. So for the relativist to say that everybody holds their own truths, they cannot support that when they become a victim. They will say this is universally wrong. Now, God, in the book of Jeremiah, he says, time is coming in the new covenant. He says, well, you'll no longer have to teach your neighbor saying, know God. He says, because they will all know me. And he says, here's why every person on the planet will know me. Because I will write my law on everybody's minds and hearts. I myself will do that. So he says, you don't even have to teach your neighbor saying, hey, know God. He already knows me. I don't care what he says about knowing me. He already knows me. God says, because I personally wrote my law on their hearts. So that their heart will either convict them or not convict them based on what they're doing. They're going to receive conviction or not because they know if they're violating my law or not. That's why the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1 will say, the wrath of God is on the head of everybody who suppresses the truth in unrighteousness. So what's inherently true about that statement? If the wrath of God is on the head of everybody who suppresses the truth in unrighteousness, you have to have the truth to suppress it. So there's no claim that there's a human being that doesn't have the truth. The question is, are you obeying it or are you suppressing it? Becomes the question. And the suppressors have the wrath of God on their heads. So it becomes incumbent for us to fight for these moral laws that are universal in nature because it points to the necessity, as Thomas Aquinas says, of there being a moral lawgiver. And I'll end on that note there. And be happy to take any questions that you might have tonight.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. We do have a fair number of questions coming in. Let me start with the question of, do animals have morality?
I don't really know, but I'm going to say no because they certainly seem to be in that mode of kill or be killed. I've watched Animal Planet, and I see these animals don't wine and dine the women. They just kind of jump on their backs and try to impregnate them. It looks much like a rape all the time. But to me, what I observe is undomesticated animals that don't become pets seem to have no morality. Now, I will say I've seen dogs who seem to experience shame. They look like they'll put their tail between their legs if their master's mad at them. They seem to experience love and shame and things like that. And I think that's why we take them as pets rather than cows and squirrels that don't seem to react that way about things. So there seems to be animals that are capable of such things. And the Hebrew word for those types of animals, we call them the nephesh animals, because nephesh is the Hebrew word for soul. And so there's some animals identified as nephesh because they seem to have emotion and love and guilt and shame, where cows and horses don't seem to so much, type of thing. So I would say there might be a morality in the nephesh animals, but not in the others. And I feel like saying, but my gosh, I could be completely wrong, so don't take me at all at my word on that. I'm just giving my gut feeling.
Thank you, Pastor Bill.
I would say to a dog, you're bad. You were bad. I don't think I'd ever walk up to a cow and say, you're bad. It just seems silly that they wouldn't have a bad or a good about them. All right, I'm sorry. You got me continuing to think about that one. Well, go ahead. I'll stop. Go on to the next one.
Thank you, Pastor Bill. We have a question here that says, did the humans who lived before Jesus have the moral law written on their hearts, or did they only have the law of Moses?
I certainly know they had the law of Moses, and based on God's kind of emphatic way of saying that a time was coming in the new covenant when he would write the law on their hearts and minds so that everybody knew him. It seems to be a new covenant principle that it would be hard for me to understand how it could be an Old Testament principle when God specifically mentions that a time would be coming in the New Covenant when he would do that. So I think before Christ they had Moses, and Jesus will say things like, you had Moses in the law. He seems to be able to blame them based on Moses rather than based on their own hearts. So I would say it's a New Testament principle only. Based on that evidence. If somebody's got a stronger argument from Scripture, I'd be open to change my mind on that. But the scriptures that I can recall right now seem to point to the answer that I gave.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. We have another question here that says, do infants and young children who die go to heaven? And if they do, is that based on the ability of them not to have morals?
I think they absolutely do, and I think it's scriptural because we only have the destiny of one infant who died in the Bible that we're actually given his destiny, and we are told that it was heaven. This is the 7-day-old son of David that dies as a consequence of David's son. Now let me say a few things about David's son that died at 7 days old. First of all, I think the Bible tells us that he died at 7 days old, not so that we can picture a 1-week-old child that died. I think the Hebrew mind would immediately go, oh my gosh, he wasn't 8 days old. Now, why would it be significant if he made it to the 8th day? Because then he would have experienced circumcision and would have been under the covenant. But he died a day short of entering into covenant, so the question becomes, what happens to a child who dies outside of covenant? And what does David say? He will not return to me, but I will go to him. That is a phrase of David's assurance that he will be reunited with his son in heaven one day. So I think that's an absolutely strong statement that children go to heaven. Now here's another reason why I believe that. Because in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve eat the fruit, what's the first thing that they realize that they are no longer innocent? It's their nakedness. So they acquire shame and nakedness upon eating the fruit. Before they ate the fruit, they had no shame and nakedness. Now, we see children that have no shame and nakedness. And I know that's certainly true of 3-year-olds, because my granddaughter will run out of the bathtub and run out here naked and say, Grandpa, look at my butt. So she has no shame in her nakedness because she's innocent right now. So there will be a day that if her parents open the bedroom door and she's getting dressed, she'll say, close the door, I'm changing. And mom might say, yesterday you're running around here naked, today you're yelling at me because you're changing when I opened the door. What happened? And my answer is she lost her innocence. She acquired shame. And I would also further express that I think that's the time to tell them about Jesus. Because now that they've lost their innocence and acquired shame, I think there's an age of accountability that starts kicking in, that they need to start knowing that Jesus is out there, loves them, and forgives them of their sins and their mistakes, and teach them to pray and say, Jesus, I'm sorry for yelling at mommy today. Jesus, I'm sorry for this. And start training them in those ways as they seem to have lost their innocence there. But yes, I believe they go to heaven before that. And I think David's story is pretty convincing of that. I would even say this. I would say all miscarriages and aborted children are in heaven in glorified bodies waiting to be reunited to their moms. I believe that as well.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. We have a question here that says...
Wait, Mike, can I interrupt again? Can I interrupt you again? Because I have a thought on that as well. Aborted children and miscarried children being in heaven. Something really amazing happened last year when Billy Graham died, because I'm pretty close with one of his grandsons, Anthony. I've known Anthony since he was in 8th grade. He's somebody in his mid-30s now. And we're closer than ever as we do some ministry together. And Anthony was very close to his grandfather, Billy Graham. They had a very good and close relationship. And a few years ago, Anthony told me that when he went to Billy Graham's 95th birthday party, he said, at my grandfather's 95th birthday party, this is before Billy Graham died, he said this to me, He said, my grandfather told me that God told him that he would live to be 100. So here's Billy Graham telling his grandson, hey, God told me I'd live to be 100. Now, when Billy Graham died, he died at 99. And you'd say, that's close. Great job, God. But you know, that's not close for God. That's way off for God. 100 is 100, and 99 is different than 100. So I started wondering and worrying, what's this going to do to Anthony? Is he going to think Billy Graham didn't hear from God, that he misspoke or lied, or what's he going to think? Because that's weird. But then when I was watching on the news the announcement of Billy Graham's death, it gave the month and year of his birth and the month and year of his death. And folks, look it up. He died at 99 years and 3 months. You take the 9 months that he was in the womb, and he's 100 on the nose. And I think when God says you'll live to be 100, he knew you were alive at conception, and he counts those 9 months. Now, part of your heart loves that, and part of your heart goes, I don't want to be 9 months older right now. Well, that's too bad. I think you are. Okay? All right. But isn't that a beautiful story of life beginning at conception, that God would use Billy Graham to say, I'm going to tell this man he's going to live to be 100, and I'm going to take him at 99 years and 3 months. Let them figure it out. All right, Mike, sorry to keep interrupting.
Just keep preaching, Pastor Bill. Just keep preaching. In here around morality, and I'm going to basically sum it up. The statement is that when trying to witness to someone that does not believe in God, a lot of times the conversation will get stuck when you try and talk about how a moral law requires a moral lawgiver. A lot of times non-believers will sort of position out of that or not accept that. How can we continue to apply pressure there?
I wouldn't. I would never go there in evangelism. Because as you're trying to lead them towards God, all they're hearing is that you think they're immoral by nature. And they're going to put up a defense to that. And I don't think that's an avenue for bringing somebody to a knowledge of God. My favorite way of introducing a topic to a non-believer is I simply take whatever we have in common. What we're not going to have in common is me thinking they have no basis for morality and them thinking they do have a basis for morality. Because they're most likely a person walking around saying, I'm a pretty darn good person. And I make pretty darn good choices. And they're not going to buy into that you believe they have no basis for that morality. So I think that's going to be a rock that you're going to hit there. What I like to do is share something that's undeniably we have in common. There's nobody that can deny this that we have in common. I'll say, what do you think happens when we die? And they're not going to go, you think I'm going to die one day? That's absurd. I'm going to live forever. Nobody's going to do that. So now that they know they're going to die, I'm asking the simple question, what do you think happens? And whatever answer they give me, if it's not be judged by God and either go to heaven or hell, then I'll say, where did you get that information? And believe it or not, a lot of times they'll say, it's just what I think. Can you imagine basing something as important as eternal destiny on just what you think? So if I get that answer, what do you think? I'll say something like this. Did you ever think the Dolphins would win on a certain Sunday and they didn't? Well, of course. Well, then what you think could be wrong kind of easily, correct? Do you want to base your eternal destiny on just what you think? If that's your answer, then that's where I'll go with it. But if their answer is, well, I'm a Darwinist, an evolutionist, I've studied Darwinian biology, and I think we just stop existing, we go in the ground, and we're just worm food. There's nothing to existence. Then I'll question that. And I'll say, have you ever thirsted? Well, yeah. Is there a solution to your thirst? Yes, water. Okay, so there's a longing that you experience as a human, and the universe has an answer for that longing, correct? Well, yeah. You ever hunger? Yes. Did you ever get an answer to that hunger? Yes, food. So the world has some sort of answer to your longings. Is there any longing you've ever longed for that there is no such thing as the solution to that longing? And of course the answer is no. Whatever I long for, there's something there that can meet that longing. And then I say, did humanity ever long to never die? Does humanity fight against death and want to go on forever and go for immortality? And the answer is yes. Well, then that must be able to be met then, because you're programmed to only long for things that can be met. So, and what am I playing on here? My belief that God has set eternity in their hearts, because my Bible tells me that God has done that. So I'm going to play on the eternities in their heart. You long to go on forever. And I'm going to say, so either that's a blip in your wiring, that you only long for things that can be met, and now you long for something major that can't be met, and there's no answer for it. Or it's consistent with all of your other wiring that you only can long for things that can be met, and you long to go on forever, so it can be met. And now, with the proof that you just gave me, that you just rot in the ground, let me give you proof that you actually don't, and you go on forever, either in heaven or hell. And I'll talk about the witnesses to the resurrection, the prophecies that it would happen that are all fulfilled, the enemy attestation of the miracles that Jesus worked. So these are not his friends calling him a miracle worker. It's actually his enemies saying, I know you drive out demons, but I think your power is from Beelzebub, not from God. But what can't they say? You've got no miraculous power. None of them can say that. And in Acts, more than once, Paul will talk about the miracles that Paul does, and he'll say to the leaders, as you yourself know that I did these miracles, or Jesus did these miracles. And he'll say these miracles were not done in a corner. He says these are public displays for everybody to see. And he's saying it in the same cities that they were done, at the same time span that they were done. So I couldn't go out in the streets of Fort Lauderdale and say, I worked all these miracles, as you yourselves know. They would all go, what miracles and who are you? Paul's able to do that because they knew of the miracles. So I have this evidence and tons more. Let's go back to what you think. You just say, I just think you go on the ground. Well, now we can get into Pascal's wager, if you're familiar with that. And this doesn't prove God's existence. This proves the absurdity of atheism. Blaise Pascal, the brilliant mathematician, said something like this. He basically said, if you're a Christian and you're right, then when you die, you go to heaven. If you're a Christian and the evolutionist is right, then you rot in the ground. If you're a Christian and you're wrong, well, that's the same as the evolutionist being right. If you're an evolutionist and you're right, then you just go on the ground. If you're an evolutionist and you're wrong, you go to hell. So the package that you sign up for with Christianity is if I'm right, I go to heaven. If I'm wrong, nothing happens. The package you sign up for as an atheist is if I'm right, nothing happens. If I'm wrong, I go to hell. So Blaise Pascal says, unless you have 100% certainty that God does not exist, then you're a fool for being an atheist because you sign up for a terrible package. Your best hope is that you rot in the ground forever, unconscious forever. But if you're wrong, you go to hell forever. The Christian's worst deal is your best deal. And if the Christian's right, they get tremendous joy and you get tremendous suffering. So what in the heck are you signing up for when you don't even have 100% certainty that you're right? He just says it's utter foolishness to be an atheist unless you can achieve 100% certainty. Now, can they achieve 100% certainty that there is no God? Well, when they say to me, there is no God, I simply say something like this. How do you know he's not sipping iced tea in the Andromeda galaxy right now? Prove it. They can't. So therefore, they can't have 100% certainty that there is no God. They'd have to be able to prove that he's not sipping tea in the Andromeda galaxy right now, because if he is, then he exists. And they can't know that, if he's doing that or not, so they can't know that he doesn't exist. The best you can be, logically, is an agnostic. You cannot logically be an atheist. Now, an agnostic will say, I don't think we're capable of knowing if there's a God or not. And to them, I'll say this. If you can be an agnostic. I can appreciate that you think we can't know for sure if there's a God or not, but if you're going to be a credible agnostic, be credible in it, then you must overcome the fact that Jesus Christ said he was God right there in the flesh. And the Apostle John will say this, that which I've seen with my eyes, I've heard with my ears, and I've handled with my hands concerning the word of life, that's what I'm making manifest to you, that he was made manifest to us. So tell me why John is not credible in that statement, and tell me why Jesus is not credible when he said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you can destroy their credibility and their statements that Jesus was God, now you're a credible agnostic. But you have no credibility unless you have the ability to overcome their arguments. Because John is a man who spent his life either being persecuted or jail-bound to tell this story. Why would he choose that lifestyle unless he really believed what he was saying?
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. We've got 2 questions left, and they are not on the topic of morality, so we're going to move off of tonight's teaching to just wrap up the last couple questions. We have one comment where someone said, they were presented in a challenging tone, the statement, "You know there are missing books of the Bible. Is that statement true?"
Well, if you don't know it, then it's certainly not true because they just said that you did know it. So that would cancel it out being true. But it also cancels out being true because he's probably speaking of the Apocrypha, which are certainly not missing. They were intentionally taken out of the Bible because during the Protestant Reformation, the standard for what goes into the Bible was raised to an incredibly high level to make sure that everything in there was authentic. And what the Apocrypha lacks that the other books of the Bible have are evidence of inspiration of the authors or conclusive evidence of miracles. Something supernatural needs to be evident in the book for it to be included in our books. The Apocrypha lack that. There's contradictions within the Apocrypha that denies its inspiration. So we don't say don't read the Apocrypha. Some of it is great, great history. We would never know about the Maccabean revolt, things like that, unless we read First Maccabees. There's some wonderful, wonderful things that Christians should know within the Apocrypha. We just simply say we don't think it's inspired by God, and we want what's contained within our canon to be of the highest standards of evidence of being inspired by God. So they're not lost. They're simply taken out because they don't seem to reach that high standard. Now, what he may be referring to as lost books is, if you read 1 Corinthians, we're pretty darn sure that Paul's referring to a previous letter to that church that we don't have. So we actually believe 1 Corinthians is actually a 2 Corinthians. And we believe 2 Corinthians is not a 3 Corinthians. We actually believe it's a 4 Corinthians. Because Paul seems to be referring to this back and forth writing between the Corinthian church and Paul. And if we read it carefully, 1 Corinthians seems to refer to something previous. That would therefore be a 1 Corinthians. And 2 Corinthians seems to refer to something in between 1 and 2 Corinthians, which would be a 3 Corinthians. So we would actually have a 2 and a 4 Corinthians instead of a 1 and a 2 Corinthians. But then they would say, well, can't God keep track of his own letters that he's trying to get out there? Yes, he can. It just means that those other 2 letters are not what he intended for us to read. He intended for us to read the 2 that we have. We absolutely believe that God superintended the books that we're to be reading today, and he made sure that those were the ones that carried on. Because remember, Jesus said this in John chapter 17. He said, God, I not only pray for my apostles, but I pray for all who will believe based on their testimony. Now remember, when Jesus said that, he wasn't yet crucified or risen. So they don't even have a testimony when Jesus said that. So he not only knows that they're going to have a testimony, but he also knows that people will believe based on their testimony, and that's you and I. So Jesus already knows that based on the writings of these men, that they've never written a thing before, that the world will come to belief in him. And he prays for that, the people that will believe based on their writings. So if Jesus knew before they ever picked up a pen to write it down, and before they even had a testimony to write down, that believers would come from their writings, then I think we shouldn't say that we lost books along the way and God is just an irresponsible God and can't keep track of this stuff, that he allows us to actually lose it on him when he's trying to redeem the world through these letters. So there's no reason to think anything got lost. The Apocrypha was intentionally taken out. So no, we don't know that we've lost any books. Absolutely not.
Great, thank you, Pastor Bill. This will be the last question of the evening. What is the strongest apologetic against Darwinism, both old and new theories?
Okay. To me, the ones that I present are all each mutually exclusive of the possibility of Darwinism existing. I would say this, just to put it in a very easily and memorable way. I would say that life, we know that life cannot come from non-life. There's no biological mechanism that would allow it to be so. And if you say, but I don't know biological mechanisms, so how do I know if there's not a biological mechanism that allows for life to come out of non-life? My answer would be this. If it's non-living, then as I like to call it, where's the magic hat? I call it the Frosty the Snowman predicament. Frosty the Snowman went from non-living to living, but he had a magic hat. Where's the magic hat of Darwinism? What allowed the chemicals in the primordial soup to come to life? The bridge that has to be gapped between going from non-living to living is unapproachable in Darwinism. You can't fathom how to go from non-living to living. And that's not even their biggest problem. Their biggest problem is how do they get something out of nothing? As we went over a few weeks ago, Albert Einstein proved that before the Big Bang, there was absolutely nothing. But now we know for a fact that there's certainly something. So how did something come out of nothing? And the three possibilities are this: spontaneous generation, the universe spontaneously generated itself, which again, there's no mechanism which allows that for it to be true. There's no observation that ever happened to show that something can come out of nothing. And it's just not reasonable that something would come out of nothing. Yet we know the universe came out of nothing. So this is why Thomas Aquinas, this is the primary reason he called God necessary. A second possibility is just that the universe is eternal. Maybe it didn't have to come out of nothing, it always existed. But then you get that pesky scientist Albert Einstein, who proved that it had a beginning. So now we know it scientifically, to a scientific certainty, that the universe had a beginning. So the only other possibility is that either something eternal created the universe or someone eternal created the universe. And it can't be a something, an impersonal force, because impersonal forces cannot create things like intelligence and love and personhood. And we have intelligence and love and personhood in our universe. So it has to be something that has intelligence and love and personhood that created these things, and that would make it a someone. So logic, when you carry logic down its path, it leads to God being necessary for the creation of the universe. So I think that cosmological argument is very strong against Darwinism, and the 5 lines of science I gave you a few weeks ago, being molecular isolation, genetic limits, irreducible complexity, molecular isolation, genetic limits, what's the other one? Something that was really good too. Those are scientific facts that don't allow evolution to be true. Now I'll go on to the fossil record that we went over last week. There are 0 in-between links. Even Stephen Jay Gould admits that and say, but we have to hold on to our theory because the only other alternative is God. That's not science, folks. So, yeah, these are, to me, the cosmological argument. Listen, the teleological argument, the argument from design. How do you have 120-something constants with trillions of odds to 1 against any one of them happening, yet they all happened? Okay, you got to believe in massive amounts of miraculous events happening over and over again, where Isaiah 45 simply puts it this way: God created the earth to be inhabited. He made everything the way it is so that man could be on the earth. Okay, that's a lot easier to believe than all these constants come true at once. Anyways, yeah, so how did something come out of nothing? How did intelligence come out of non-intelligence? How did life come out of non-life? These are all unanswerable in Darwinian evolution. Something can't come out of nothing. Creation can't create itself. They only believe in the natural world, correct? So they have to believe that creation created itself. Now think about that. For creation to create itself, creation would have to already exist to have the power to create, and would also have to not exist because it needs to be created. So they're stuck with the need for creation to both exist and not exist at the same time. Is that possible, to exist and not exist at the same time? It's not possible, but it's necessary for the atheist to have happened. All right, so anyway, that's my 2 things. Those 7 things are my 2 things. Hope to see you in 2 weeks. God bless you until then, and even beyond then.